On the morning of January 3, 1777, British soldiers fought through the smoke outside the small town of Princeton, New Jersey, believing they were about to finish what months of campaigning had failed to accomplish. Ahead of them, an American general refused to retreat. His infantry had already begun to break. His horse had been shot. His officers urged him to fall back, but he stayed where the fighting was thickest, trying to rally men who were already giving ground. Then the British closed in. The general fought on foot until disciplined British regulars surrounded him with fixed bayonets. They demanded his surrender. He refused. Seconds later, he disappeared beneath a storm of steel. When the smoke cleared, the American commander lay mortally wounded in the frozen orchard. To many British officers, the conclusion seemed obvious. They believed they had just killed George Washington. It was an understandable mistake. The dying officer wore a general's uniform. He'd exposed himself where few commanders ever would. More importantly, he had behaved exactly as many expected Washington to behave, personally trying to save a collapsing line instead of escaping to safety. For a brief moment, one of the most professional armies in the world believed the American Revolution had lost its commander. But they had killed the wrong man. The officer lying in the snow was Major General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish-born physician who had once fought against the British before fleeing to America after the failed Jacobite Rising of 1745. Years later, he had become one of George Washington's most trusted commanders. His death would become one of the most tragic moments of the Revolution. Yet the British mistake proved even more important than Mercer's sacrifice. Because while they believed Washington had fallen, the real commander-in-chief was still alive, only minutes away from the battlefield. Before the day ended, he would ride directly into British musket fire, stop a retreat that had already begun, and turn one of the darkest moments of the campaign into a victory that shocked both armies. The question is not why Washington became famous for Princeton. The real question is why the battle reached this point in the first place. Because just 10 days earlier, Washington had achieved what seemed impossible. On December 26, 1776, his exhausted Continental Army crossed the icy Delaware River and captured nearly 900 Hessian prisoners at Trenton. It was the first major American victory after months of retreat across New York and New Jersey. Newspapers celebrated it. Patriot morale surged. Men whose enlistments were about to expire agreed to remain with the army for a little longer. The Revolution, which had seemed only weeks away from collapse, suddenly had hope again. But the victory at Trenton solved only one problem. It created another. The British command could not allow Washington to remain in New Jersey after such a public humiliation. General Lord Charles Cornwallis, one of Britain's most capable field commanders, gathered roughly 8,000 veteran troops and marched north from Princeton, determined to crush the Continental Army before it could escape again. Washington had fewer than 5,000 effectives, many exhausted after weeks of winter campaigning. His soldiers lacked blankets, proper shoes, and reliable supplies. Some had wrapped rags around bleeding feet just to stay in formation. Against them marched disciplined British regulars who had spent years mastering European battlefield tactics. On January 2nd, Cornwallis caught up with the Americans near Assunpink Creek, just south of Trenton. Throughout the afternoon, British infantry launched repeated attacks against the narrow bridge crossing the creek. Each assault was beaten back by concentrated American musket and artillery fire. As darkness fell, the fighting stopped. The British camped less than a mile away. Many officers believed the campaign was effectively over. Cornwallis himself reportedly postponed the final assault until morning, confident that Washington had nowhere left to go. From the British perspective, every road north was blocked. Every bridge was watched. Every obvious escape route had been sealed. The trap appeared perfect. What they failed to notice was that Washington had already begun planning a move no British commander expected. Instead of retreating, he was preparing to march directly toward Princeton. Washington had escaped impossible situations before. He had slipped away from Brooklyn in the fog after the disastrous Battle of Long Island. He had preserved his army during the long retreat across New Jersey when many believed the Revolution was already finished. But the situation outside Trenton on the night of January 2nd, 1777, was different. This time, there was almost no room left for improvisation. Behind the Continental Army flowed the icy Delaware River. In front stood Lord Cornwallis with roughly 8,000 experienced British and Hessian troops. Between them ran Assunpink Creek, where American artillery had barely held the line through the afternoon. By every conventional measure, Washington had reached the end of his campaign. That was exactly what Cornwallis believed. His confidence was understandable. British reconnaissance reported the American campfires burning behind the creek. Pickets watched the bridge throughout the night. Officers expected that dawn would begin with a coordinated assault, forcing Washington either to surrender or attempt a desperate retreat across the frozen river. Instead of attacking immediately, Cornwallis made a decision that historians have debated ever since. He waited until morning. It was not arrogance alone. British troops had marched hard throughout the day. Darkness made coordinated assaults dangerous, especially against prepared artillery positions. Cornwallis believed he already possessed every strategic advantage. Why waste disciplined regulars in a confusing night attack when daylight promised a cleaner victory? Military logic supported the decision. Washington intended to exploit it. As British soldiers settled into their camps, American officers quietly gathered around Washington for one of the most important councils of the Revolutionary War. The options were brutally simple. Stay where they were and face overwhelming numbers at first light. Attempt to retreat across the Delaware, risking panic on frozen river crossings. Or do something no European commander would reasonably expect: march around the British Army. The third option bordered on madness. Between the two armies lay frozen fields, narrow country roads, orchards, and patches of woodland unfamiliar to most American officers. Thousands of soldiers would have to move silently through the middle of a winter night. Cannon, ammunition wagons, supply carts, and horses would all have to keep pace without alerting British pickets only a short distance away. One broken axle, one frightened horse, one musket accidentally discharged. Any of these could expose the movement and trap the Continental Army between Cornwallis and the garrison at Princeton. Washington accepted the risk. Around midnight, the army quietly abandoned its camp. The deception began almost immediately. Small detachments remained behind to keep campfires burning. Others continued digging defensive earthworks and occasionally struck the frozen ground with picks and shovels, creating exactly the sounds British sentries expected to hear from an army preparing for another day of defense. Across the creek, British outposts listened. Everything sounded normal. The Americans, they assumed, were strengthening their position. Meanwhile, thousands of Continental soldiers disappeared into the darkness. The winter roads were barely passable. The ground alternated between frozen solid and patches of mud where wagon wheels threatened to sink. Artillery crews wrapped iron fittings with cloth to reduce noise. Officers repeatedly halted the column whenever horses became restless. Orders passed from unit to unit in whispers rather than shouted commands. For hour after hour, the entire army marched only a few miles from one of the largest British forces in North America without being discovered. It was an extraordinary feat of discipline. But Washington's objective was not simply escape. If he only fled, Cornwallis would resume the pursuit within hours. The campaign would continue exactly as before. Washington wanted something much larger. About 10 miles northeast stood Princeton, where Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood commanded roughly 1,200 British regulars guarding the road between New York and Cornwallis's army. Most British officers assumed Mawhood faced little danger. Washington was trapped to the south. No substantial American force could possibly appear behind British lines before sunrise. That assumption would become the foundation of everything that followed. Because while Cornwallis prepared to destroy Washington at dawn, Washington was already marching toward an entirely different battlefield. Just before sunrise on January 3, 1777, Washington's column approached Princeton from the south. The march had worked. Against extraordinary odds, nearly 5,000 American soldiers, along with artillery and supply wagons, had slipped around Cornwallis's army without triggering a major alarm. But escaping the trap had only solved the first problem. Now they faced another. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood had no intention of surrendering Princeton. Mawhood was one of the British Army's most capable field officers. A veteran of earlier campaigns around New York, he commanded approximately 1,200 regulars, including the 17th Regiment of Foot, one of Britain's experienced infantry formations. His mission was straightforward: maintain communications between Princeton and the main British force farther south. At first light, Mawhood's men began marching toward Trenton. They expected to reinforce Cornwallis for what everyone assumed would be the final blow against Washington. Instead, scouts reported something impossible. An American army was moving directly across their line of march. For a few moments, both commanders struggled to understand what they were seeing. Washington believed he had encountered only a rear guard. Mawhood initially assumed these were scattered militia attempting to escape north before Cornwallis closed the trap. Both were wrong. Within minutes, two armies that neither side expected to meet were deploying for battle. Washington needed time. His long night march had stretched the Continental Column across muddy roads for nearly 2 miles. Units were still arriving. The artillery had not fully deployed. If Mawhood attacked before the Americans formed properly, confusion could spread through the entire army. Washington turned to one of the officers he trusted most, Major General Hugh Mercer. Mercer was 60 years old, a veteran of 2 wars and 1 failed revolution. Born near Aberdeen, Scotland, he had fought as a surgeon during the Jacobite Rising of 1745, supporting Charles Edward Stuart against the British Crown. After the Jacobite defeat at Culloden, British troops hunted surviving officers across Scotland. Mercer escaped only after months in hiding before eventually emigrating to Pennsylvania. Ironically, the same empire that had once driven him from his homeland had now become his enemy again. By 1777, Mercer had earned Washington's complete confidence. He was not the most famous American general. He was not the most politically influential. But he possessed exactly what Washington needed that morning: experience, composure, and the willingness to hold impossible positions. Washington ordered Mercer to move forward with roughly 350 Continentals and delay the British advance long enough for the rest of the army to form. It was not an attack designed to win the battle. It was a sacrifice measured in minutes. Mercer's men crossed frozen fields lined with split-rail fences and orchards before encountering Mawhood's advance guard. The fighting opened with scattered musket volleys. For a brief moment, the Americans gained the advantage. British light troops fell back toward the main column, and Mercer pressed forward, believing he faced only a screening force. Then Mawhood reacted. Recognizing the danger immediately, he halted the rest of his regiment, wheeled his infantry into line with remarkable speed, and ordered a disciplined volley. The effect was devastating. British muskets erupted almost simultaneously. Mercer's front ranks staggered. Before the Americans could recover, the Redcoats lowered their bayonets and advanced at a run. This was exactly the kind of attack British regulars practiced endlessly on European drill fields. The Continental soldiers facing them were exhausted after marching all night. Many had no bayonets at all. Some fired a hurried final volley before turning to reload. They never had the chance. The British charge smashed into Mercer's line. The American formation collapsed into fierce, close quarters, fighting among trees, fences, and frozen fields. Smoke covered the orchard. Officers disappeared from sight. Commands dissolved into individual struggles for survival. In the confusion, Mercer tried desperately to rally his men. His horse had already been hit. He continued fighting on foot, sword in hand, refusing to abandon the field even as British soldiers closed around him. Then British officers noticed something. An American general, still standing, still refusing to retreat. Exactly where George Washington himself was expected to be. Within moments, the battle and the entire campaign would hinge on a fatal mistake. The British soldiers surrounding Hugh Mercer had every reason to believe they were facing George Washington himself. The American commander-in-chief had built a reputation for leading from the front whenever the situation became desperate. Reports from earlier campaigns described him appearing where the fighting was fiercest, trying to steady collapsing units by sheer force of presence. Now, in the smoke-filled orchard outside Princeton, they saw another mounted American general refusing to abandon his men. From their perspective, the conclusion was obvious. Mercer's horse had been shot beneath him, but he kept fighting. British infantry closed in from several directions, shouting for him to surrender. he answered with his sword. The fighting became brutally personal. Unlike the disciplined volleys that had opened the battle, this was combat measured in feet rather than yards. Muskets became clubs, bayonets became spears. Men slipped on frozen ground, stained with blood, and churned into mud by hundreds of boots. Mercer was struck repeatedly. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but contemporary witnesses agreed on the outcome. He was beaten to the ground, stabbed multiple times with bayonets, and left for dead after refusing repeated demands to surrender. Some British soldiers reportedly believed they had just killed Washington himself, while others simply knew they had brought down a senior American commander. In the confusion of battle, there was no immediate way to verify his identity. Mercer was still alive, barely. Local residents would later find him among the wounded and carry him into a nearby farmhouse. He lingered for several days before dying from his wounds on January 12, 1777. But none of that mattered to the men still fighting in the orchard. What mattered was what happened to the American line. Mercer's brigade disintegrated. The soldiers who had survived the British bayonet charge streamed back across the fields, many without officers, many convinced the position was lost. Smoke hid the scale of the disaster, but the effect spread quickly. Units arriving from the night march encountered frightened men running in the opposite direction. Confusion spread faster than accurate information. General John Cadwalader, advancing with Pennsylvania militia, attempted to stop the retreat. Instead, his own men hesitated. Most had little experience facing veteran British regulars in open battle. They watched disciplined redcoats emerge through the smoke with bayonets fixed, their formations still remarkably intact despite the close fighting. The psychological effect was immediate. Cadwalader's front ranks fired an uneven volley. Some muskets misfired in the damp winter air. Others fired too early. The volley failed to stop the British advance. Then came another bayonet charge. The militia broke. Some units turned before the British even reached them. Others tried to reload while falling back. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to restore order, but once movement began, it accelerated. Men collided with fresh arrivals. Artillery teams struggled to bring guns into position as infantry crowded the roads behind them. For several critical minutes, the Continental Army stood dangerously close to complete collapse. From Mahood's perspective, everything was unfolding perfectly. He had identified the enemy first. He had shattered the American advance guard. He had driven back additional reinforcements. Now the road north appeared to be opening. If he continued pressing forward, he might break through Washington's scattered column before the Americans could establish a proper battle line. Even if Princeton itself could not be held indefinitely, destroying Washington's army mattered far more than defending the town. The initiative belonged entirely to the British. Then something unexpected happened. Riders appeared through the smoke. At first, few soldiers recognized who they were seeing. Then, a familiar figure emerged on a tall white horse, galloping directly toward the fleeing Americans instead of away from the fighting. Word spread almost instantly. Washington, not dead, not behind the army, here. And instead of organizing another retreat, he was riding straight toward the advancing British line. George Washington understood something that few commanders in the 18th century would ever attempt. At this moment, orders alone would not stop the retreat. The soldiers had already seen Mercer's brigade collapse. They had watched experienced Continentals driven back at bayonet point. Many believed the British breakthrough was unstoppable. Once panic begins inside an army, it spreads faster than any officer can ride. Washington knew there was only one way to reverse it. He had to place himself where every fleeing soldier could see him. Riding his white horse, Washington cut directly across the retreating Americans, shouting for units to halt and reform. Officers later recalled him seizing regimental colors, pointing toward the enemy, and ordering broken formations back into line instead of allowing them to continue fleeing toward the rear. It was an extraordinary gamble. If he failed, the Continental Army would likely dissolve around him. If he succeeded, the battle would begin again on entirely different terms. Washington rode toward a slight rise overlooking the advancing British infantry. Behind him, American artillery under Captain Joseph Mulder's command was finally reaching positions where the guns could be brought into action. Fresh Continental regiments, including veterans under General John Sullivan, were also arriving after completing the night march. Time. That was all Washington had needed. Mercer's sacrifice had bought exactly enough of it. Mawhood recognized the danger immediately. Only minutes earlier, he had been attacking scattered detachments. Now organized American infantry was appearing across his front in steadily increasing numbers. If Washington completed his deployment, the British would lose the advantage they had fought so hard to gain. Mawhood ordered another aggressive advance. The Redcoats dressed their ranks with remarkable discipline despite the chaos of the battlefield. Drums beat the advance. Officers walked behind the line with drawn swords, correcting intervals as if they were still on a parade ground. Then the British opened fire. A crashing volley rolled across the frozen fields. Musket balls tore through the smoke toward Washington's position. Several American officers instinctively pulled their horses aside. Washington did not. Instead, he continued riding straight toward the British line. For a few astonishing seconds, he was completely exposed. One eyewitness later estimated that Washington came within roughly 30 yards of the British front before ordering the American line forward. Whether that distance is exact remains debated, but contemporary accounts agree on the essential fact. He deliberately placed himself within lethal musket range at the decisive moment of the battle. His officers were horrified. Some later admitted they expected to watch the commander-in-chief die. General John Fitzgerald, serving on Washington's staff, reportedly could not bear to witness the moment. Convinced that no man could survive such concentrated fire, he covered his face with his hat rather than watch the inevitable. The smoke swallowed everything. For several long seconds, neither side could clearly see the center of the battlefield. Then the wind shifted. Washington was still in the saddle. His horse was untouched. The American line behind him had not broken. It was advancing. The psychological effect was immediate. Continental soldiers who had been retreating only moments before now moved forward with renewed confidence. Officers rallied companies that had nearly disintegrated. Artillery crews completed their deployment and opened fire with canister, blasting gaps through the advancing British ranks at devastatingly short range. The balance of the battle changed almost instantly. For the first time that morning, it was the British who found themselves under coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Sullivan's Continentals pressed from one flank. Mulder's guns hammered the British center. Cadwallader's men, encouraged by Washington's presence, began returning to the fight instead of running from it. Mawhood's soldiers resisted with the professionalism that had made the British Army feared across Europe. Again and again they halted, dressed their lines, fired disciplined volleys, and counterattacked with bayonets. But they were no longer facing isolated American detachments. They were confronting an army that had recovered its commander, restored its cohesion, and seized the initiative. The mistake made in the orchard was beginning to reveal its true cost. The British had spent precious minutes believing they had destroyed the heart of the Continental Army. Instead, the real Washington had used those same minutes to rebuild it. By now, the battlefield had become something neither commander had expected when the morning began. Washington had escaped destruction. Mercer's sacrifice had bought the Continental Army time. And the disciplined British counterattack that had nearly shattered the American line was beginning to lose momentum. For Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, the situation was changing by the minute. His original mission had never been to fight an entire Continental Army. He had intended to march south and reinforce Cornwallis. Instead, he had stumbled into Washington's full force and now faced growing pressure from fresh American units arriving faster than his own men could replace their losses. Still, Mawhood refused to surrender the initiative without a fight. Gathering roughly 300 veterans from the 17th Regiment of Foot, he formed them into a compact assault column and launched one final attempt to break through the American center. It was a classic British maneuver. The regulars advanced in disciplined ranks, halted on command, fired controlled volleys, then pressed forward with fixed bayonets before the enemy could recover. It was the same method that had broken Mercer's brigade earlier that morning. This time it failed. Washington's line no longer consisted of isolated detachments arriving piecemeal from the night march. General John Sullivan's Continentals had completed their deployment. American artillery had found the range. Militia that had fled only minutes before were now returning to the line behind veteran regiments instead of standing alone against British regulars. For the first time that day, the numerical advantage belonged entirely to the Americans. Canister fire ripped through the advancing British formations. American infantry answered with coordinated volleys instead of scattered musket fire. Every minute that passed made Mawhood's position worse. Recognizing that remaining in place meant encirclement, he made a difficult but disciplined decision. Rather than allow his command to be destroyed where it stood, he ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Princeton. The retreat was anything but a rout. British companies repeatedly stopped, turned, fired volleys to slow the American pursuit, then withdrew again in remarkably good order. Officers maintained control despite mounting casualties, and small rear guards repeatedly bought precious time for the rest of the force. It was exactly the kind of professionalism that had made the British Army one of the finest fighting forces in the world. But professionalism could not overcome the strategic reality. Washington had recovered. His army was growing stronger with every passing minute. Mawhood's was growing smaller. As the British fell back into Princeton, fighting spilled into the streets. American troops entered the town from multiple directions, while British detachments searched desperately for routes of escape. One of the final centers of resistance developed around Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey, today's Princeton University. British soldiers occupied positions nearby as American artillery was brought forward. According to long-standing accounts, Washington ordered a cannon into position and directed fire toward the area. One of the shots struck Nassau Hall itself, reportedly passing through a window and damaging a portrait of King George II inside the building. Whether every detail of that famous story occurred exactly as later generations described, the broader reality is clear. British control of Princeton was collapsing. Some units escaped north toward New Brunswick, preserving part of the garrison. Others became isolated and were forced to surrender. By late morning, approximately 200 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, while the Americans suffered similar overall casualties, though the loss of Hugh Mercer made the victory especially costly. Yet the importance of Princeton cannot be measured by casualty figures alone. The true victory had taken place hours earlier. It had happened the moment Washington slipped past Cornwallis during the night. Everything afterward, the clash with Mawhood, Mercer's stand, the collapse of the American line, Washington's ride into musket fire, and the recapture of the initiative, flowed from that single operational decision. When news finally reached Cornwallis, the realization was immediate. The army he believed trapped south of Assunpink Creek had marched around him, defeated one of his detached commands, and disappeared again before he could bring his superior numbers to bear. One of Britain's best opportunities to destroy the Continental Army had vanished overnight. But the consequences reached far beyond a single battlefield. Because after Princeton, something far more dangerous than an American army began spreading through the colonies. It was belief. The belief that Britain could be outmaneuvered. The belief that Washington was more than a commander who survived defeats, and the belief that the revolution might actually be won. The Battle of Princeton lasted only a few hours. Its consequences lasted for years. In purely tactical terms, it was not the largest engagement of the Revolutionary War. Fewer than 7,000 soldiers fought there. Casualties were modest compared with later battles such as Brandywine, Germantown, or Monmouth. But wars are not decided by numbers alone. They are decided by momentum. Only weeks earlier, the Continental Army had seemed close to collapse. During the retreat across New Jersey, enlistments were expiring. Thousands of soldiers had gone home. Congress had fled Philadelphia. Loyalists believed the rebellion was entering its final stage, while many neutral colonists were waiting to see whether resistance still had any future. The victories at Trenton and Princeton changed that calculation. Together, they shattered the image of British inevitability. For the first time since the disastrous campaign around New York, ordinary Americans saw something they had almost forgotten was possible. The British could be beaten. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked discipline, but because they could make mistakes, and Washington was capable of exploiting them. Cornwallis had not been defeated because his army fought poorly. His soldiers had marched with remarkable speed. forced Washington into what appeared to be an impossible position and prepared for what should have been the decisive battle of the campaign. His mistake was believing the campaign was already over. One quiet winter night gave Washington exactly the opportunity he needed. Hood, meanwhile, demonstrated why British regulars remained among the finest soldiers in the world. Outnumbered and surprised, his force nearly broke the Continental Army before it had fully deployed. Even during the retreat through Princeton, British units maintained discipline under relentless pressure, preventing what could have become a complete disaster. Their professionalism was undeniable, but discipline alone could not overcome a commander willing to accept extraordinary risks at precisely the right moment. Washington's greatest achievement at Princeton was not simply his famous ride toward the British line. It was everything that came before it. The decision to abandon the campfires at Assunpink Creek, the silent night march around Cornwallis, the willingness to divide his army in darkness, the confidence to attack instead of retreat. And when those plans nearly collapsed after Mercer's death, the resolve to place himself where the battle was being lost. That single act became one of the defining images of the American Revolution. Whether every eyewitness remembered the exact distance between Washington and the British line in the same way is less important than what all of them agreed upon. He was there. He exposed himself to enemy fire when many commanders would have remained safely behind their troops. His soldiers saw it. The British saw it. History remembered it. Yet perhaps the most remarkable moment came even earlier. In the smoke-filled orchard, British soldiers stood over the mortally wounded Hugh Mercer, believing they had killed George Washington. For several precious minutes, they thought the commander who held the Continental Army together was dead. They had the wrong general. Mercer's sacrifice delayed the British advance just long enough for Washington to arrive. Those minutes allowed fresh American regiments to deploy. They allowed artillery to reach the battlefield. They allowed a collapsing army to become a fighting army again. History often turns on decisions. Sometimes it turns on accidents. At Princeton, it turned on both: a mistaken identity, a delayed attack, a silent march through the frozen night, a commander willing to gamble everything. Together, those moments transformed what could have been the destruction of the Continental Army into one of the most important victories of the Revolutionary War. Had Cornwallis attacked before dawn? Had a British picket discovered the night march? Had Hood broken through before Sullivan arrived? Had Washington fallen during his ride across the battlefield? The story of American independence might have unfolded very differently. Instead, the Revolution survived. And on a cold January morning in 1777, the British learned one of the hardest lessons of the entire war. Defeating George Washington's army would never be as simple as believing they had already killed him. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more battles where a single decision changed the course of history, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which moment from the American Revolution we should cover next. Thanks for watching.